So I also found that there were many failures of justice that allowed these two states to remain functioning. And first of all, there was the stripping of land, and that led to an unequal distribution of resources. So when land was stripped away, people were taken out of their homes. They lost a lot of power. When you are thinking about where to try and find food and a place to live, you're busy with something else other than, trying to get your just rights. So there was an equal distribution of resources because it allowed the state to gain the resources it wants, the workers it needed to strengthen its own economy. And so progress wasn't for everyone. The people who progressed were, in South Africa, the white people. They got richer. They grew. They were creating businesses and exporting to the rest of the world. And this is part of why the rest of the world was okay with it, because it was serving a good economic purpose. But with the rest of the races in South Africa, they weren't gaining much at all. And the other failures of justice was that the police and the military were participating, and they were the ones upholding the states. So we see that in, let's say, in Israel, where all the time it's the army who come and do the demolitions. It's the police, that the direct confrontation between them and the Palestinians. And the same case in South Africa when they were moving people away, or when they were trying to suppress protests, you would have direct confrontation with the police and the military. And so there were fabricated justifications against these groups who tried to resist. They call them terrorists, the same word used in South Africa and in Palestine. They say that, the national security issues, and they go and claim that in the UN and to the world to try and justify the presence of the police and the military and the need for segregation. And also in the political process itself, so what we mean by elections and citizenship, so it upholds apartheid by making them different citizens and giving them different rights, different voting rights. And also this excludes the voices of the majority, because in South Africa the majority were the African people, but they were completely excluded from the political process, not given those rights, and this suppressing them allowed for the continuation of the apartheid state, because their voices were not heard to the rest of the world. Yeah. So there was the policy of suppressing resistance. So they tried to silence those who questioned the prevailing order, and they did that. They did that by punishing. They did that by punishing people and threatening them with severe punishments if they did resist. So we can see Nelson Mandela was jailed. They tried to assassinate Palestinian leaders such as Ahmed Yassin, to show the rest of the population that even though you try to resist, if we can get your biggest leaders, then you have no power at all. This is what they tried to convince. They tried to play with the morale of the nations. And so they tried to corrupt the morality to reduce the people's morale. So we could see the same case in South Africa and in Palestine. They tried to teach people not about the things that we find important. They try to spread more entertainment, try to distract them with different things, try to show them that so they try to distract them away from the actual issue, which is that there's an injustice and that you need to actually rise and change that. So the bigger picture is excluded in the education system that they provide the Palestinian children. And so also it happens in demonstrations of power. So whenever they feel that there's some kind of uprising, they go and they violate or they go in and enter into some village and damage it, and to show that, okay, you're trying to play that you're tough, well, we'll show you who's more powerful. And they did that in South Africa as well. So this suppression of resistance, they continually tried to do it. As we saw just a few days ago in Al-Aqsa Mosque, people tried to come up with the uprising. They're faced with tanks, they're faced with soldiers, and then they go to the UN and say, well, we have national security problem. So yeah, and what we found in many quotes that say that in Israel, the brutality is way more extreme than in South Africa, because they can still claim that Israel, there's a war zone, and so they come out with the full military, whereas in South Africa, a state that claims that it's stable and it wants a strong economy, and it claims that to the rest of the world, it can't come out it can't commit the same kind of war crimes, because it's not giving itself that identity that it's in a war zone, that it has that kind of enemy. So that's why a lot of people say what's happening in Israel is actually way, way more extreme than what happened in South Africa, simply because they claim that there's a war still going on, and that there's issues of security, and there's issues of the enemy. Yeah. Yeah. So with international appeasement, there was South Africa did it and Israel does it. They do a lot of compromises with other states. They say that we can offer you, economic benefits. They do many treaties, and so this leads to a choice not to harm relations, and therefore this led to the continuation of apartheid. So that's why many states choose not to boycott. The US gains a lot from the presence of Israel in the Middle East. It's good for its oil companies, it's good for its military, and so for example, Israel was used often to sell weapons to El Salvador and Guatemala, whereas the US couldn't do the same thing because the eyes would be on it. Yeah. So now in South Africa, we all know apartheid no longer exists. So how did apartheid lose support? There was worldwide movements against racism, and colonialism around the whole world was starting to end. So in India there was no colonialism anymore. In most of the world, the states began to gain their independence, and so there was less legitimacy in the democratic states to support such a state. And so my argument is that instead of supporting a colonial state, South Africa right now turned into a neo-colonial state. I wouldn't say that South Africa is so much a successful story, because we know that there's a lot of corruption that goes on. There's a lot of problems. The government in South Africa isn't necessarily the one that the people who were resisting were expecting to have. And so I would still say there's a neo-colonial state, and that's kind of part of why the West was more eager to support it. With the issue of Israel, it might be quite harder. Next. So in Palestine, I would say that unlike the argument for South Africa, economic justifications for ending Israel shouldn't further the exploitation somewhere else. So if we say we're going to end, like we're not going to support Israel anymore, the governments shouldn't try and find another state to get its economic interests out of. So instead, what we should try to do is that we should pressure our governments to make principled decisions that Israel is not a just state. We need to, so this can happen through educating ourselves, so that what happens in South Africa isn't completely replicated in Palestine, so that when Palestine is liberated, the replacement, the government that they get is one that will serve the interests of the people, not some kind of corrupt government such as the one that's present now in South Africa. And that's what I believe our duty is. So there needs to be a moral collective conscience that needs to grow, and when this moral collective conscience grows within the masses, then that's only when there would be a good change in Palestine.